Great. Welcome back. I hope you enjoyed your lunch and are excited, as I am, for the rest of the day. The next panel will be on the topic of Sino-Western relations with Professor Chen Jian on the chair, to the furthest left there, with panelists Jacques deLisle on my left and P.Bottelier in the middle. Unfortunately, Arne Westad won't be here for this discussion. As some of you may know, he was rushing from his previous panel already. Each guest will speak for around 10 to 15 minutes, leaving around 30 minutes for Q&A at the end. A formal introduction. Yes. Jacques deLisle here is a professor of political science and a director for the Center for East Asian Studies at the University of Pennsylvania. Additionally, he was attorney advisor for the Office of Legal Counsel for the U.S. Department of Justice. Pieter is a senior advisor on China to the Conference Board and visiting scholar at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. He has held multiple positions in the World Bank, including senior advisor to the Vice President for East Asia. And Professor Chen Jian of Cornell University held the Philip Roman Chair in History and International Affairs at the LSE and is a fellow of LSE Ideas. He is also the Michael J. Zach Chair of the History of U.S.-China Relations at Cornell University, where he serves as director of the China and Asia Pacific Studies Program and is a distinguished research scholar. And now I'll hand over to Chen Jian to chair the discussion. Thank you.
There's nothing more scary than the kind of sudden assignment to be told that I am promoted. So I'm empowered to chair this session, but I don't know how to do this, except I will be ruthlessly controlling time. And first of all, I told my fellow panelists that I will be self-disciplinary. So let's have, each of us, I believe, will be having 10 minutes. And let's begin with Jacques, please.
Thank you very much. I'm going to take out my watch so I can watch the time here. All right. Well, it's a pleasure to.
And I want to remind you, we now have 49 minutes 31 seconds. According to this instruction.
Does that come out of my time just now? All right.
Yes.
All right. Well, that's fair. All right.
15 seconds.
Hey, stop. I feel like I'm on one of those auction shows. Anyway, this is a panel on China's relations with the West. I'm going to speak mostly about China's relations with the United States, partly on the principle of write what you know, and also partly because there are a lot of countries in the West, but also partly because I think most people would agree among China's relationship with the West, the relationship with the U.S. is the most important for China. Increasingly, China is the U.S.'s most important bilateral relationship. And I think the bilateral U.S.-China relationship casts quite a long shadow over China's relations, not only with the West, but with its neighbors as well. So the big story here, of course, in the last few years on the U.S. side, certainly of the Obama presidency, is the pivot or the rebalancing strategically toward Asia. There's been much talk about it. I'll say more about it later in my remarks. That's on the security side. In the economic sphere, the sort of milder or smaller scale effort that has accompanied that is the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, ostensibly a grouping of market economies in a trade liberalization and economic integration type arrangement. And most recently in President Obama's second inaugural address, we've seen hints of a possible re-emphasis on the democracy and human rights agenda and foreign policy. There was very little foreign policy in the inaugural address. What there was a reference to these values issues. So on the three perennial legs of the tripod and the three perennial sources of friction sometimes in U.S.-China relations, security, economics, and values issues, we see the U.S. doing things that seem to engage China in ways that China finds, as I'll say later, troubling to threatening. On the Chinese side, we have a somewhat mirror image set of developments. On the security side, PLA modernization continues apace with significant investments with a particular focus on things that are of concern to the U.S. So area access denial capabilities in the seas near China, initially the first island chain, but also increasingly what seems to be a blue water Navy goal, the acquisition of an aircraft carrier, well short of a functional aircraft carrier battle group, but still. Anti-submarine warfare, anti-satellite warfare, lots of information warfare. These are all technologies that are particularly useful in a scenario of possible U.S. military presence or conflict near China. And there is this broader force projection which the aircraft carrier suggests, in which China's engagement in the development of port facilities that could be of military use in Sri Lanka, Pakistan, and elsewhere farther afield. More broadly, there's a phenomenon we've talked a lot about in the prior panel here today, which is the rise of a more assertive foreign policy posture for China, particularly on security issues, especially but not exclusively the territorial disputes, the island disputes, particularly with Japan, but also with Southeast Asia. And a rising popular nationalism, although there's much room to debate about how much of that is genuinely constrained and how much of it is cultivated in a kind of two-level game for engaging the U.S. and saying, what can China's leaders do? They must pay attention to domestic nationalist concerns. Excuse me. There's also, with the transition to the fifth generation leadership, a critique of Hu Jintao as sort of the Jimmy Carter of Chinese politics, right? The wasted decade, the inept presidency, but in particular that he didn't stand up enough for China, that didn't have enough of an assertive foreign policy. On the economic side, of course, there are concerns about slowing growth and the social and political consequences of slower growth and rampant inequality, and therefore this commitment to rebalancing toward domestic consumption. That's part of the story, and it's an inevitable adjustment, but from the foreign policy side, it coexists with a continued pursuit of regional trade integration, pursuit of CJK, possible free trade areas, building on the ASEAN-China free trade area, building on ECFA across the strait, and from the US view sometimes trying to construct an East Asian economic bloc that is China-centered and potentially US excluding. On the values issues, China has pushed back in recent years more forcefully against US calls for human rights and democracy. Hu Jintao, Wen people of that very high stature, saying Western-style democracy and separation of powers is unsuited for China. The people who've been in charge of the law portfolio on the Politburo Standing Committee saying that the Western-style rule of law is not suited. So what to make of all these patterns? Well, what I've suggested is that on each of the three major fronts, security, economics, and values, there's friction, there's trouble, there's even potential for crisis, particularly it seems recently on the security front. And that does exist, but one needs to take that with some perspective. That is, these tensions come against the backdrop of what has been a remarkably good and stable relationship for quite some time now, especially if you compare it to the baseline of not too many years ago. So as recently as the late 1990s, and even into the last decade, the early 2000s, think of what it looked like. We went from the Korean War to the Taiwan Straits crises in the 1950s, through the Cold War and the Vietnam War in the 60s, very gradual rapprochement in the 70s, the derailment from the Tiananmen incident in the late 1980s, the US blocking China's WTO entry for some years, partly on human rights grounds, and the US sponsoring human rights resolutions at the UN to censure China, the Taiwan Straits crisis in the middle 1990s, the Belgrade embassy bombing, the EP3 incident. I mean, we haven't seen something like that in quite a while now, so we're coming off a period of very good relations. That said, though, there are reasons for concern and elements of friction here. So what to make of what the US has been up to, the US pivot? Well, the pivot should not be overread. It's really quite modest in many ways. I would suggest that it's partly a US return to a focus on Asia, which is where US economic and strategic interests primarily lie. We have short attention spans in America. We were attracted by shiny objects. So if there's a crisis in the Middle East and Afghanistan and Iraq, even if the crisis we make, that becomes the focus. And in some sense, what you're seeing is a return to normalcy, a reappreciation of where the real interests lie. Secondly, the pivot may not turn out to be much. We're poor now. We don't have the fiscal wherewithal to have a gigantic navy. We're largely shifting a larger share of a shrinking pie over toward Asia. We're also not terribly reliable. We're awfully fickle. We tend to get sort of self-absorbed, and so there is reason for doubt about how durable the US commitment is, unless, God forbid, there be a real crisis in East Asia again. But finally, and somewhat less flippantly, I think it's also important to understand how reactive the pivot is. China sees it as an aggressive act against China, but the US could not do it materially and politically, and therefore would not do it if the US were not being invited in by regional states. That is, everybody is hedging against a rising China, partly out of a natural reaction to rising Chinese power, partly out of a reaction to Chinese assertiveness. So the pivot is responding to demands from the region. The TPP, I'm skeptical about how far that will go. It's kind of cobbled together among disparate states, and it's going to be devilishly hard to pass anything that requires congressional action for trade liberalization with the US. And on the values thing, well, human rights, democracy are a not very hardy perennial in the American garden of foreign policy. We talk about it from time to time, but it rarely drives matters. But you know, there's still a problem here. I know I'm starting to run short on time, so let me turn to what's going on both sides of this relationship in the relatively near future. On the US side, I think we see the latest turn in our long-running ambivalence toward China, what I call congaging our frenemies. That's congaging and engaging our friend and enemy. You know, much of this is simply a reaction to China's growing economic and hard power clout. And in the US, there is a genuine recognition of China's rise. Our debate is about how quickly the gap is closing and whether this is a long-term relative decline of the US. Now, it's kind of a false debate. Because China can have a great impact on US policy toward Asia and US policy toward China long before it reaches parity economically or militarily. In the US, the stronger debate is actually about how to assess China's, not its capacity, but China's will. Is China a profoundly revisionist great power, rising great power, or not? So one side of this debate says China is economically integrated with the world, it's still focused on economic development, it depends on a stable and peaceful external environment, it's ruthlessly pragmatic in its foreign policies despite rhetorical flourishes and some sovereignty disputes, and it is either socialized or socializable to international norms. And that's kind of the Chinese story to some degree too, except for the last bit. On the other side of the debate are the sort of John Mearsheimer style realists who say that when you've got power shifts, conflict's going to happen no matter what people's intents, subjective intents are. Or alternatively, so it's the Germany-Japan analogy, or alternatively a view that China has a particularly revisionist agenda. It doesn't need to have it, but it does have it. And it is increasingly trying to challenge US-created international institutions and an international order. Security, economics, and otherwise, or what I call the non-democratic, non-peace thesis, right? You all know the democratic peace thesis. Well, this is the view that systems that are fundamentally different politically are prone to some degree of friction and conflict, and that's a reason China is not to be trusted. On the Chinese side of the debate, we see, again, a mirror image. The object of debate in China is not so much about the US will. There's a widespread, and in my view, exaggerated view, it seems, that the US has ill will toward China and is trying to keep China down, and this is encirclement and all that. There doesn't seem to be a whole lot of dissensus on that. And the US, but what the debate is in China is about is whether the US is in significant, permanent, relative, and perhaps absolute decline. That has huge implications for Chinese policy. There is one school of thought that says, you know, it's China's century, time to move forward, be assertive. That has held sway in some ways that I think have been destructive to Chinese foreign policy interests recently. But arrayed against that is a view that worries very much that China will overreach and get into trouble. I know I'm just about out of time, so let me just say where I think we are now, which is we have a security dilemma of the sort. The US views its role in the Western Pacific, in East Asia, as providing benign order and public goods. Open sea lanes of communications, regional stability, a relatively liberal economic order. And China, however, views this as threatening. Why is the Seventh Fleet on our doorstep? Why is the US, with all of its reckless fiscal and trade behavior, still claiming to underwrite the rules of the economic system? China, on the other hand, sees its forced modernization, its extension of its roles, its claiming of a place at the table to shape the international order in economics and politics and security as the natural thing for a rising great power, whereas the US sees that as aggressive. It sees it as anti-status quo, trying to change the rules, and asserting a desire to displace the US from providing a regime that has worked pretty well for China. So I think that sort of misperception, misconnect is a big part of the problem, and I'm sorry for going a minute over.
Thank you very much, Professor. I'm praising you more for setting up such a very useful, comprehensive, and to the point framework for this panel. You have done an excellent job, and it makes my job much easier. Yes. Now, Professor.
Thank you. I'm going to cover some of the same ground that Jacques covered, and focus in particular on US-China relations, even though the name of the panel is much broader. But since
we believe that the West actually is US. That's the definition of this panel.
Apologies to the European friends.
I think if US-China relations are on the right track, China-Western relations are expected to be on the right track. So you're right. It's extremely important. And I must begin by saying that I agree with Jacques that in spite of all these problems that he has alluded to, and I will pointed to some more, it is surprising that the relationship has remained so stable, and that neither side, I think, is trying to take advantage, overtly advantage of the relative strengths they have acquired. My bottom line, and what I propose for discussion here, if we have any time left, is trade policy and investment policy. Let me start with my bottom line. One of the most important initiatives that the Obama administration has taken in its first term, as Jacques mentioned, is the TPP proposal. TPP stands for Trans-Pacific Partnership. That is an existing arrangement between 4 relatively small countries, New Zealand, Singapore, Brunei, and Chile, agreed in 2005 to form a TPP. The Obama administration has seized upon that to broaden the proposal to a much broader and much more comprehensive trade agreement, free trade agreement, between like-minded countries across the Pacific. And the Chinese are very unhappy about that because they perceive this proposal as an instrument to exclude China, rightly or wrongly, but that's how it is perceived in China. Several major countries have not yet decided whether to actually actively participate in it. And surprise, surprise, Japan is one of those. So I agree, TPP is a major thing playing at the present time. It would be a useful subject for discussion in the Q&A period. But let me, that's my bottom line. Let me put it a little bit in perspective. The shift from west to east in terms of all sorts of powers, economic power, financial power, military power, is likely to continue from now on, and if anything, intensify. Asia is going to be the center of the economic world. It has been the fastest growing area in the world and is likely to continue. According to the latest IMF World Economic Outlook report, the expectation for this year is that Asia will grow at 6.4% compared to 6% in 2012. US, 1%. Europe, 0. Japan, maybe 0. That's roughly the situation. And of course, the heart of the Asia economic performance is China. China is by far the largest player, and the whole picture of the West-East shift is really dominated much more by China than any other country, including India. India is potentially also a major player, but India is not catching up with China. All you can say about India is that the pace at which it is falling behind is slowing down, right? So it is really, the story is China. And let me illustrate that with some key numbers. And I'm an economist by training. He is a political scientist, I guess.
Lawyer.
So,
I'm completely untrained.
Some numbers, just to highlight the importance of this. China accounted for half the global economic growth, half, in 2009 and 2010. In the last year, 2012, and for the next few years, it is expected to account for about 1/3 of global growth. And that is when China's share in current GDP is still only about 11 or 12%. Now, that illustrates something. The US thinks of itself as the center of the world, and it has always been, since the end of the Cold War, the locomotive that pulled the global economy. The locomotive that is pulling the global economy today is not the US, it's China. And not just by a little bit, but by a very wide margin. China is by far the largest player on global commodity markets. When real estate investment in China slows down, as it did from the beginning of 2010 onward, iron ore prices go down, copper prices go down, zinc prices go down. The US is not a big player anymore on global commodity markets except oil. Now, this is important to realize.